Although my book is called Haunting Paris, I never really set out to write about Paris. I'm so clearly not French, not Jewish, neither man nor ghost. What I am is an étrangère, a stranger, a foreigner, an outsider. But what gave me a way into the story is the voice that I heard, the voice of the ghost. And a ghost is the ultimate outsider. You know, the thing about writing is that as writers, we don't always choose our stories. Sometimes they choose us. And so it was with this story. It's set in Paris in 1989 when the whole city, the whole country is getting ready to celebrate the bicentennial of the French Revolution, that seminal moment in French history that gave us the glorious motto that you can still see chiseled on every public monument, every building, wherever you go, the words liberté, égalité, fraternité. But up in her apartment, Sylvie is mourning the loss of Julien, who died some months before. And then, quite by accident, she discovers a letter in his desk and she sets out on a quest. She did know that Julien's sister and his two daughters were rounded up. And what she didn't know was that Julien always believed that perhaps one of the daughters had managed to escape. So, armed with this letter and a very scant clue, she goes back into the deep secrets of Julien's past and to the year 1942, when the Jews were rounded up in Paris and France singularly failed to live up to its own glorious promise of liberté, égalité, fraternité. So, this is a love story in which one of the lovers is dead, a detective story, a mystery, which is solved by a pianist who is so cripplingly shy that she's known as Sylvie La Timide, a historical novel which has really urgent resonances for today, and a ghost story in which the ghost is the least frightening thing of all. So, do I believe in ghosts? No, of course not. And yet, when you are in Paris, you can't escape their company. They are all around you, and they are particularly thick on Ile Saint Louis. And every time I sense their presence, I want to look over my shoulder and ask them, who are you? What brings you back? But they retreat into the shadows and into silence. So many scenes in the book take place in and around Notre Dame, but behind the soaring towers that reach for the sky, there's a museum that sinks into the earth. And it was at the Memorial de la Déportation that I became aware of the darker shadows that underpin the City of Light. And that's where the story took a very different turn from what I had imagined. You know, if you've been there, you know that there's a bronze circle on the floor chiseled with the words, "They went to the end of the earth and they did not return." And then my hair stood straight up as I remembered the word for ghost in French, revenant, one who returns. So that became the first line in my book. And I also had the answer to the question, what draws you back? So I'll just read briefly from the first page. And then, as many of you know, Jim Shepard, he's a very shy and retiring guy, but we'll try and draw him out of his shell. So here's the first page. They call us revenants, those who return. Restless for this world, we pass each other in mute recognition, for to be silent and solitary is our essential condition. But death doesn't end our thirst for a human touch, a human voice calling our name. And so I haunt these familiar quays, this familiar river. Music drifts down from Sylvie's window, and I linger until it comes to an end. The scent of lilacs on the breeze stirs dormant phantoms to life, but music is sorcery more potent. Though bound to time's measure, it exists on a plane beyond time, where there is no past and no future. There is only the present, in which the dead revisit this world. Night after night, I wait until the last notes fade away, and Sylvie comes to the window at last. I retreat into the shadows as one after another the beautiful mansions along Quai d'Anjou spring to light, transforming those in the gloom below into a throng of ghosts. Occasionally, a passing figure pauses in a pool of lamplight to light a cigarette or glance at a watch. Squandered time, the most enduring of regrets. In the end, a lifetime is not enough. The heart yearns for more. Who can reason with desire? The heart has its reasons that reason cannot know. Okay, so that's my reading, and now we will draw Jim out of his shell. He's called thank you. Jim is called a writer's writer, but I'm here to tell you he's very much a reader's writer as well. And he will break his silence now.
Thank you, Mamta. That was beautiful. I've always understood writer's writer to be code for nobody else reads him. But I'm hoping there's something more to it than that. Your notion that you are coming to your debut very late reminded me, Amy Hempel will remember this, but in the 80s, Viking got very excited because they had a novelist, a first-time novelist named Harriet Dorr, whose first book, Stones for a Barrow, was coming out, and she was 73 years old. And they had a giant publicity campaign ready, and they discovered that a rival publisher had a writer named Helen Hoover Santmeyer, whose first book was coming out, and she was 88 years old. So poor Harriet Dorr was like, well, you mean I'm not that exciting anymore? And everybody's like, well, we got an 88-year-old over here, so we got you beat, essentially. So there's always somebody older who's working on a book you'll be happy to hear. In the spirit of log rolling, I was going to start with a lot of compliments, but I know how much you hate those, Mamta. So let's go directly to one of your comments about being an outsider. We'll start there. If you imagine that a writer's default position is some kind of exile, boy, have you got that covered. You've lived in Miami and Calcutta and Paris, is that right? Mm-hmm. 3 cities very similar. What are as a writer, the advantages and disadvantages of being so schizophrenic in terms of place, in terms of wildly different places like that?
They are wildly different, and it's 3 cities that I love, 3 cities that are by a mythic and legendary river, 3 cities that are just crazy about books. But that's all that I can think of that they have in common. At least Calcutta and Miami are tropical, subtropical, but Paris is so out of the realm of what I consider home. And yet it's a city in which I feel completely at home. And I think, I want to ask you this about your books too, that the outsider's perspective is a very helpful perspective from which to write. Mm-hmm. You are on the threshold, not quite inside, not quite outside. So it gives you a purchase on life there in a way that you may not have if you either belonged or were completely away from the scene.
Mm-hmm.
But you've written about, you know, a Polish ghetto, you've written about Pompeii, so tell
Well,
me about...
it does all sorts of things, right? I mean, not only does it allow you to remember you need to defamiliarize some of these worlds for your reader, but it also allows you to instantly get at a set of emotional stakes that are quite important to you, while at the same time pretending that you're not getting at stuff that's really, really crucial to you, right? Because when I sit down, I can say, oh, I'm not writing about my own tattered emotional life. I'm writing about a completely different world. And of course, you work your way around to your own tattered emotional life one way or the other. Being a male, I'm one of those people who doesn't sit down at the desk every morning and go, well, time to confront my most difficult emotional problems. So I need to sort of channel that 10-year-old who'll say, oh no, I'm writing about volcanoes, or I'm writing about the French Revolution, or I'm writing about something else, so that I can essentially teach myself what I need to be doing. And it felt like in a lot of ways you were doing the same thing in this project, right? You were, by sort of mobilizing the ghost, you were getting at any number of obsessions, sort of emotional obsessions that you could then put into concrete form, I would think.
That is so true. And, you know, even though this is my first novel to be published, it isn't the first novel I wrote, as people who've been in master classes with me will attest. And so I wrote about India, I wrote about America, and then, you know, it came close, but never quite got picked up. So I said, the heck with this, I'm going to write about, you know, as Monty Python says, and now for something completely different.
Right.
So I thought I'm going to write this sparkling, light, lovely book about Paris. And in the first page, I'm already into the depths of darkness. So you're right, we can't, Jim, escape our own bent. But you were talking about channeling a 10-year-old boy. I have never heard anybody capture that voice as well as you do. You know, I remember how when you read from the Book of Aaron at Skidmore at one of the readings there, we were all just speechless at how you absolutely got to it, even though this is a young boy in the Warsaw ghetto that you were writing about. You were able to summon up that voice. So
now this is threatening to turn into log rolling 101 here. And I notice you very deftly changed the subject. We're supposed to be talking about your book, Mamta. I'll be happy to accept compliments right and left in this case. But I want to work our way back to Haunting Paris, because that's what we're selling today, if we can. If we
okay.
can. You know, for me, one of the great achievements of the book is that its account, a sort of day-to-day account of what it's like to live with absence. And that's exactly the kind of sort of emotionally weighty thing that I don't think most writers sit down at the desk and sort of say, oh, that's what I'm going to encounter today. You know, that's the kind of thing that sort of piles in whether you like it or not. How early in the process did you realize that that was a central thematic aspect of the book?
Well, the moment the ghost voice came to me, you know, a ghost is predicated on loss. And so, yeah, so that was one of the very few things I knew early on, and one of probably the only thing that didn't change in the course of writing the book. But there are many levels of loss that reverberate throughout the book. I mean, there's obviously Sylvie's personal loss. She's mourning her lover. There's the loss that Julien lived with, you know, the loss of his sister that sort of shaped him, essentially, his life, his character. And then you think that this is one family's loss, and then you take the incalculable number of families that were affected by these roundups, by the Holocaust, and that loss becomes, you know, almost unbearable. And then when you think of the loss, I think that so central to this book is the loss of the idea that France has of itself. So
You know, with a ghost figure or a revenant figure, of course, you have both ends of the spectrum, right? You have on the one hand the ghost figure, who is quite powerful and helpless at the same time. On the other hand, you have the figure who is being haunted by the ghost or knows about the ghost or whatever, and that's the figure dealing with another kind of loss, right? In this case, the actual revenant reminded me a huge amount of Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire. Do you know that film?
Yes, I do.
It's such a lovely, for those of you who haven't seen that film, good news, your whole afternoon has been worth it already. You should go out and check it out. It's a wonderful German film from the 70s that features a guardian angel who is, well, the premise is that our guardian angels are everywhere, and they're just standing there behind us, sort of mournfully watching us make mistake after mistake. And they're both very, very compassionate and pretty helpless. And that sense of both the comfort and the pain of invisibility is a lovely aspect of the book that seems to me to come. The only other place I've seen it in some ways is Wenders' film, I think. That sense of, I'm off the hook because there's nothing I can do anyway, but I'm on the hook because I have to watch all of this unfold, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a beautiful film, and it's very much suffused with that same kind of yearning to both be part of this world but not be able to affect it in any way.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of that helplessness is there. But you know, when we're talking about ghosts or spectral presences, there is no template for it. You know, each ghost has its own way of haunting.
Right,
and
you get to make it up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's twice made up. It's a character, and then it's a character who's not even alive anymore. So
yeah, and speaking of those metafictional aspects, you know, what you're able to model as well is your own distance from and intimacy with the material at the same time, right? The same way the ghost is close and not close, and the ghost is part of the world and not part of the world, you can, in a metafictional way, model your own anxieties and strengths as a fiction writer in terms of your relationship to the material, right?
yes,
Make it
and
concrete.
that makes it sound so much more intelligent than the blundering process I went through to
Well,
get to
that's my
this
job
point.
today, is to make it
Yes,
sound
thank you.
intelligent.
Thank
Do what I can.
Keep log rolling. You know, I don't mind the compliments one bit, I've discovered.
It is a nice way of getting at the hubris, though, don't you think? You know, that sense we all have of where do we get off doing this?
Well, you know, I think in a way, I don't know if it's hubris or not, but I think that it certainly plays into this ability to inhabit different worlds and to know that all you have to do is make the reader believe in that world. So if you believe in it, it's strongly enough, then they will believe in it. One of the things that you all tell me, because I'm not in your position, but I know that a lot of writing programs and a lot of writing teachers say, write what you know, and it's sort of, as Zadie Smith puts it, it's almost as if they're telling you, stay in your lane. But the imagination has no lanes, it just swerves and careens all over the place. So I think when you're dealing with something that is not your own, and of course you're right, it is your own in that you're confronting loss and longing, but it's not that it has to be your story, but whatever story you're telling, you have to ask, am I doing it justice? And then you have to think, well, the people whom I'm telling it about, will they think I'm doing it justice? I think that's really the way, the litmus test to see if it's working or not.
Yeah, and in fact, I think this issue of appropriation and staying in your lane is just another way of putting pressure on an aspect of writing that we should always be alert to anyway, right? We should always be trying to render things with as much complexity and respect as we can possibly render them. And we should always be calling to account failures in that regard. But failures in that regard seem to me failures of technique, not instances where somebody tried something they weren't allowed to try. That seems like a crazy idea, right? As far as I'm concerned, I just keep thinking, why were we given something as amazing as imagination if we're not going to use it, right? And if someone said to me, good news, Jim, you can only write about your own experiences from here on in, I think I would just quit and block hats or something like that, or just torment my dogs all day. There just isn't enough interest in it for me. I need to, and I also need, again, that transformation, that ability to say, I'm writing about an entire other world that allows me to get at my own, essentially.
That's right. And sometimes the more foreign the world is, the closer it is to home, you know, to the bone of what you're writing. And speaking of bones, go ahead.
Well, in your case, for example, by mobilizing this ghost, you're getting at over and over again this issue of passion versus dispassion, right? Or intensity versus comfort, or stuff like that. Stuff that's clearly emotionally very important to you in various forms, but it's allowing you to get at it at an angle and to sort of turn it in the light and play with it however you'd like to play with it. But also in so doing, teach yourself.
Yeah, I think all books that, whether we read or write them, teach us how they should proceed. You know, you don't set out, well, at least I don't. I know there are more efficient writers who set out with a compass and a map and everything, but I wish I were of their ilk, but I'm not. But I think also it's true that you're trying to get at something, and in you know how they say the past, Faulkner said the past is never dead, it's not even past. It's something that very much struck me in writing this book, because it does deal with a ghost who has access to time periods in the past that somebody living would not, which is you know, one of the parameters I was able to set up, because it's my ghost and he can haunt however he likes. But my parents, when the British left India, they divided it into two countries based on religion. And my parents found themselves on the wrong side of the religious divide. So the country that they thought was India was no longer India. It was now Pakistan. And they had to cross over to an India, which was not their home. So they had essentially become, you were talking about exile, become exiles, strangers, foreigners in their own country. And, you know, if I felt like an étrangère in Paris, well, that's perfectly understandable. But to be a stranger, a foreigner, and, you know, an outsider in your own country, which is what happened to the French Jews when, as French as anyone could be, and then this dividing line is drawn, and all of a sudden, they're not French anymore. So that gave me some purchase on the material as well.
You're both part of a world and not part of a world. Again, the way the ghost is, right? It can be a sort of a liminal presence, as it were.
Yeah.
But I cut you off before. Was there another question you wanted to ask?
Well, it wasn't really a question, but, you know, we talked about things cutting to the bone. You talked about torturing your dogs. And I want to tell you that one of my favorite characters in the book, one that was sheer unadulterated pleasure to write, you know, I didn't have these moments where I felt like slitting my wrist, was Coco, the dog. And your wife, who's a very fine writer herself, Jim Shepard, wrote a dog poem, which I think was partly in my mind when I created Coco. So do you want to recite the poem, or shall I?
Boy, I'm going to tell her. She's going to be deeply flattered. Yeah, this is one of those poems that is very easy to commit to memory. It's Amy and I did an anthology called Unleashed, which is poems by writers' dogs, poems in the voices of writers' dogs. And Karen and I did one of our dogs, Birch, had a poem that went in its entirety, because Birch was a big lab who ate everything. And Birch's poem in its entirety read, are you going to eat that? Are you going to eat that? Are you going to eat that? I'll eat that. And that was it. That was the whole poem.
That's right. It's a great philosophy to live by. And
now I know that it's inspired a good novel. This is very exciting news, I have to tell you.
I remember Amy Hempel reading it at Skidmore, and you don't know what things what remains from what you have heard and read.
Well, Amy also gave you the great advice, I'm sure, at Skidmore at one point or another: when in doubt, bring a dog into your fiction. So, you know,
Oh,
a version of the old Raymond Chandler, when in doubt, have a man enter a room with a gun. Amy, who's not quite as belligerent as Raymond Chandler, just thinks, why not work a dog in if you can, right?
well, I didn't get that particular piece of advice, but you know, I can't say that I brought any character into the novel. They just sort of knocked on the door and came in, and sometimes barged in, and I was just like, oh, hello. And so I sat and listened to them. One of the things that, when we were talking about the past, one of the things that I've really been thinking about a lot now, since we are all confined to our homes, I hope we are, that time has become very strange. You know, it's blurred in a way that it stretches out, and yet it's compressed in the ways that memory often is. You don't remember things in a linear fashion. We no longer live this, you know, weekday, weekend life. And that's very much the ghostly sense of being in the world, is sort of everything past, present, blurring. And what stands out is what, you know, Virginia Woolf calls moments of being, or Wordsworth calls the spots of time, is the intensity of the experiences you're having, however circumscribed they are now, and whether they're actual experiences or relived experiences,
Right.
are heightened, I think.
Yeah, and those heightened experiences may pop out even more because of this weird limbo state we find ourselves in right now, right? Most of the writers I talk to, are, you know, keep saying it's very weird to be trying to work on their own work, and to, I just feel like life is going on because there's this sense of, oh, wait, are we waiting for a vaccine? Are we waiting for the world to go back to normal? Are we going to acknowledge it's not going to go back to normal? You know, are we going to be Zooming for the rest of our lives? It feels like we're in a kind of a waiting period of indefinite length, which is, you know, again, not a bad description for the ghostly situation, or you know, the Catholic purgatory or something like that, right?
Right. Well, you know, it's when you were saying Zoom, it's like we spend so much time waiting in the waiting room in Zoom to be let into whatever the event is that is taking place. And I remember thinking when my book came out, okay, now, you know, all I need is a stretch of time and solitude in which to really work on the next book. And so I have the time and I have the solitude, but you know, it isn't just that makes you write. And
Right.
there's so many writers who've had books come out now at this time, and so many people from the Institute who have books out. You know, Bob Boyers has his The Tyranny of Virtue. Amy Hempel's book, Sing to It, came out. Margot Livesey has The Boy in the Field coming out next month. So there are just Honor Moore's memoir, Our Revolution. And I'm thinking, this is really, really strange. Every moment of writing has some sort of anxiety built into it. You know, first it's, will I finish the damn thing? Then it's, will anyone, you know, read it? Will I find an agent? Will I find a publisher? Will it go out in the world? Will anyone like it? So they're just, you know, higher classes of anxiety as you move along. And I just remember last year, before the book came out, I heard Garth Greenwell, another luminary from the Institute. He gave a commencement speech at Bennington College. And it's really wonderful. It's about, it distills the essence of why we write. And the rest is all noise. So that was very helpful to listen to and read when my book was coming out. And I didn't even have COVID anxiety at that time to deal with. So.
Well, let me ask you one more craft-oriented question, and then speaking of letting other people in on it, we can open it up to some of your fans and let them barrage you with praise. How's that? Does that seem like a good plan?
I'm here for it. Yeah.
One of the things I tell my students is that writers are pack rats and always want to make use of all of the work that they've already done. If I've done this research, by God, it's getting into the book, that kind of thing. I assume you did a buttload of research for this, but I also assume that some research never made it in or had to be streamlined out. Can you give the other writers some examples of stuff that you had to lose along the way after putting all that hard work in?
Yes, I certainly can. You know, a full third of the book fell by the wayside.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah, this just shows you how neurotic I am. Not enough that I'm dealing with 1989, 1942, other periods in French history. It isn't even my history, you know. So I'm researching all this.
Right.
And not complicated enough for me. I put in a whole layer of Paris under Roman occupation. Okay, so you have
Wow.
Nazi occupation, Roman occupation, and Nan Talese, when she was editing the book, she both published it and edited it herself. She just said, that has to go. All those years of research, but it's a much better book for that being cut out. And you know, one of the books that I really liked was when Michael Ondaatje and Walter Murch are talking the
The conversations, yeah.
Right. It's about editing film. But, you know, it works in the same way that what you cut out, if you have done the work well, leaves a trace. And so in my case, the trace is that the Emperor Julian was in that time. So in Julien's name, we have this little artifact that is left over as if from a, you know, some archaeological dig.
That's great.
So nothing is wasted. You're right, Jim. Nothing is wasted.
Merch has to be one of the most interesting and profitable to read people out there, especially from the film industry. One of my favorite quotes of his was he said something like, in his experience, the people he's met who are the happiest are people who are doing something approximating what they were loving when they were 10 years old or something like that. And, you know, he ended up being a sound editor, a regular editor, but also a sound editor. And when he was 10 years old, he had a little tape recorder and he just went around the ultimate nerd recording all of these weird sounds and playing with them. And he found a way to make that his life. And he's happier than you and I are. And that seems fair.
Well, you're channeling 10-year-olds all the time.
That's true.
You should be ecstatic.
True. But I don't have a tape recorder. That's really the main difference. Okay. So should we open up to other people? What do you think?
Yeah, when you say fans, you know, we happy few.
Yeah, we band of brothers, exactly.
Right. So let us gather and ask Jim or me anything you like, and he will answer very coherently, and I'll try to make sense of what I'm saying.
And Rachel's fielding questions too, right, Rachel?
Yes, people can either ask questions on camera if they want. That will be, you'll just need to unmute yourself, wave your hand if you want to do that. That will be part of the recording that we're doing that will be on YouTube later. So if you don't want to be recorded, you can stay muted and use the chat box to ask a question, which either Davith or I will read out. And while people are doing that, I actually have a question for both of you. You both alluded to the difficulties of writing right now. Are either of you working on projects right now that you'd be comfortable telling us a little bit about?
Mamta, do you want to go first? Oh, you want
no,
me to?
Jim, you go. I want you to go first.
I finished about 5 weeks ago a novel about a pandemic, believe it or not, and delivered it to Knopf, who had my publisher, who had bought it in advance, and they were like, "What do we do with this?" And they didn't know whether to bring it out right away or never to bring it out. So they're going to bring it out next summer. And one of the interesting things about the way it landed at the house is that it was just this thought experiment for them. If you're in the middle of a pandemic, when is a good time to have a novel about a pandemic? And as you might guess, the answers are all over the place, right? So that is supposed to come out in the summer, and I've tried to start working on another story just as a way of, again, not driving my dogs crazy. And that I'm just, I'm in the research stage of that. So when I'm in the research stage, essentially what I'm doing is reading weird shit and imagining that there's a reason I'm doing it.
They're going to have to bleep you out there, but
Yeah, I can live with that.
yeah. Well, you talk about not driving your dogs crazy. I've been driving my husband crazy. It's been a full-time job, and I have to say I'm quite enjoying it. But there's something about a second novel, and since you have passed that, decades ago.
Now I feel old.
Yeah, well, you are old. What can I tell you? I mean, I'm like, what's the name who felt at 73 that she was the young one in the bunch,
Right.
But the second novel has, I think, a much more terrifying aspect to it because there are some expectations set up. Before that, you're just sort of writing and who knows if it'll see the light of day. And now you have this and people are saying, are you going to write something with these characters? And I'm, no, they've bid me adieu and moved on. So I'm not writing about them. But it is very hard to settle down to the next thing. But I really trust that it will come. I've had a couple of false starts. So I think I'm just not drinking enough. Once I start doing that, it'll come.
That's part of it, yeah. I think it's also a measure of the resourcefulness of writers in terms of making themselves unhappy, that you sort of go, the first novel is the hardest, and then the second novel is the hardest, then the third novel is the hardest. I mean, ultimately, you're right that as a first novelist, it's harder to disengage from the idea that your book is out there in the world. You want to keep one eye on it. But the other thing you realize, and it's probably a function of ambition as well, is that whatever the thing is that in front of you, that's what you begin to become convinced is the most difficult thing you've ever done.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just that's one of the reasons I think people don't marry writers as well.
Well, I think one of the things too is it's like, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own
In their
way.
own
So
way,
every,
yeah, exactly.
that's writers, every neurotic writer is neurotic in his or her own way.
Exactly.
Mamta,
So
there's a question here for you from our participant Rimco. She's wondering, what keeps you from going back to an earlier unpublished manuscript? One of the two that you mentioned, one of the two earlier novels. Why not work on that?
Well, that's a very good point, but I'm just wondering if the experience of having written this book has changed me in a way that those novels are no longer where my head is. I have thought of going back and sort of reworking them, but it seems like the world has moved on. I have changed, and those have been rejected before, so it takes a real girding of the loins to go back to something that you feel was already sort of stamped with failure. But thank you, Remco, for assuming there will be another book, whether past or future.
So we've got someone with a 201 area code. They don't have their name here with their hand raised, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute them to ask their question. There you go.
Go ahead. Hello?
Yes, you're on. Hello.
It's Ruth Greenfield. And I wanted to say hello to Jim.
Hi,
and
Ruth.
Say, hello, my dear.
Oh.
What a good combo you guys are.
Oh.
Because you're sharing everything that is meritoriously valuable. And I'm just so glad that you're together.
Well, we're both
and
members of the Ruth
my love to both
fan
of
club.
you.
Thank you, Ruth. Ruth is our dear friend, our mutual friend who lives in Miami, who's a virtuoso pianist, and who, if you read the acknowledgements, you'll see that she was one of the major inspirations for this book. We love you, Ruth. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Ruth.
Hey, Toast.
She's 96. Hey, we are all, in her light here.
Amy here has a question. I'll unmute her.
Hi, Jim and Mamta. This
Hi,
is sort
Amy.
of like being at the Institute without being at the Institute. So I have two questions. Mamta, you said they're both kind of personal, I think, but I'm going to ask them anyway. We'll pretend we're at Bob's house for dinner.
Yeah.
So you said you thought this novel changed you. How did you feel? How do you feel you were changed?
I think that I became more aware of, things as Jim was saying about my own demons and things that are really, in this world, one of the things you do is sort of what is extraneous just sort of falls away. And I think that's another way in which this horrible virus around the world, and we're thinking, what world are we living in? In Jim's formulation, is this the world to come? So I think I'm changed in exploring those things, those subjects, not necessarily going back to, that time period or those people, but I want to dig deeper into what allows us to recreate this horror time after time. We say never forget, and what are we seeing all around us in the world today but horrors that are being perpetrated, and you just think, have we learned nothing? I mean, I know you're condemned to repeat history if you forget it, but what if you remember it and you're still seeing it happen? So I think that's made me much more aware of perhaps subjects that need to be explored more than I have in my own life. In real life, I'm really funny and light, and in my writing, I go to the darkest places. And thank God it's not the other way around, because, I wouldn't have a single friend left, but that's how it changed me.
I don't know. I kind of love the two combined, I guess. But then that's my book. As my family, we're sort of the Addams family. So maybe. But my other question, that's a nice segue, actually, what you just said, Mamta, for my next question, which is, I have ghosts in my book, so I'm asking this because I'm curious too. But, we use them metaphorically, but what would you do if, we both say at least I said, you said it here, I don't believe in ghosts, but I write about them. What would you do if a ghost showed up? Would you like that or not?
I'd love it. I'd love it. And I loved your book. I loved your memoir, the ways that you summoned up, the family past. And if you haven't read Amy Wallen's memoir, I highly recommend it. But if a ghost came, I would say, tell me your story. And maybe that would be the second book. I would welcome them in.
It could happen. That's what the reason I asked that question is I feel like as writers, we always talk about these characters that show up and talk to us, but then we like to say we don't believe in ghosts. Just saying. So anyway, I was kind of curious because I would love to have a ghost show up too. Thanks for the plug of my book, but that wasn't the purpose of it. But thank you. I love both of you being here. You're definitely, like Ruth said, you're a great duo. So
I think it suggests a really interesting faith in the supernatural for both of you to go, I'd love to have a ghost show up. There's a lot of protagonists in horror films who said that, and then things didn't work out so well for them.
Right. And I watched all of those.
And you watched all of them as well.
Yeah. And yet I still want one to show up. I think mine's friendly though. I kind of like Casper, so. Anyway, thank you guys.
Thank you. Other questions?
I've got a question for you, Mamta. We're in a weird position now that we can't travel to anywhere. We can't travel anywhere, but we really are forbidden from traveling to Europe. How does that feels strange to me, even though I wasn't planning on going anytime soon. So I'm wondering, surely you've thought about this as well with having written Haunting Paris. What are you going to do when you can go back? What are we seeing? What does this mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is the thing that for readers, you can go anywhere at any time. So you just pick up a book that takes you there. It's the best magic carpet there is. But yeah, it's very peculiar that America should be the outcast. You know, I'm used to that with India, with travel bans, with things happening. But to feel that as an American with an American passport, there might be places, not that it's not safe for you to go, but you are not safe for them. That's a very difficult thing to wrap your mind around. And in fact, I was supposed to read in person at the American Library in Paris, which was, you know, just made me feel really good, because when I was researching this book, one of the fears I always had is that somebody would go and, you got this wrong about Paris, or you misplaced this building in this arrondissement. And you know, if you got something wrong, that a Parisian will be only too happy to point it out to you. So it hasn't happened yet. But so there is a sense of not being able to go to a place, but there's also a sense of getting it right in terms of time. You know, if you have the moral responsibility to get right these little details about a street or a building, how much more when you're dealing with something like the Holocaust. The weight of that is much more. So I don't know when we'll be able to travel again. You know, my mother's in India and I'm not able to go now and see her. She's okay, but India's in lockdown as well, and it's spreading. So, you know, if somebody could write a book about a pandemic and deliver it to Knopf right around now, I'd be very interested in reading it.
If only that happened.
Well, Jim, you know, you should tell them that you've got, you know, legions of fans waiting for it.
And if by legions we mean Mamta, we're all set, I think.
That's it. But who else do you need?
And
you
Amy,
know?
there you go. Amy's waving. There you go. And Rachel,
Well,
okay. And
we contain multitudes.
exactly.
So we have time for one last question. And Jim, I wondered if you would like to ask. Oh, actually, Salita looks like you would like to.
Salita has a
Okay, I'm going
question.
to go ahead and unmute you. Hold on one second. Okay. There you are.
Okay,
Okay, go ahead,
good.
Salita.
Mine is really short, so there'll be plenty of time for Jim. But I just wanted to know when this book is going to come out in French. I'm teaching a French class as a volunteer, and Mamta is one of my students. And so I've talked about her book to a lot of French friends, and they're all asking, when is it going to come out in French? Is there an answer for that?
Je ne sais pas. That's my answer. I have no idea, aucune idée. You know, that would be great. And to tell you the truth, Salita, I would be very interested in knowing how the French might receive this book, because in a way it talks about French complicity. You know, we can talk about Nazi occupation all we want, but there was a great deal of complicity. There was a great deal of silence. So I'm not sure how it would be received, except of course that my love for Paris is so evident that perhaps that would override other things.
Well, and also I think, I mean, the whole question of being in the resistance or being in, you know, out of the resistance. During the war, there were a limited number of people that were in the resistance. After the war, everyone had been in the resistance. I had a professor at the university who actually had been in the resistance and got a medal for it. So he had physical proof, but he said everybody that he knew all of a sudden had been in the resistance. So I think it depends on the attitude that the people have or the amount of guilt that they have, whether they would enjoy the book. All the people I know would adore the book. I mean, it's not a huge number, but I've got a group of people that would absolutely adore the book. So have you explored it at all? Have you explored finding a translator or?
You know, I don't even know how this works. I think that It's not you who
actually-
explore it.
The publisher
the-
actually puts it out to, and has an agent taking it around Europe, seeing if other publishers are interested, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's logical. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a logical book to get translated. So maybe while you're
Thank
trying
you.
to think about what you might be writing next, you might try seeing if you can get your book out in another version in France.
Okay.
You know,
Thank you very much.
the film critic Dwight MacDonald had a wonderful line about everybody being in the resistance. He was reviewing Sound of Music, and he was noticing that in the Sound of Music, all of the Austrians were anti-Nazi. And Dwight MacDonald said in his review, "Who were all those people cheering in the newsreels?"
Yeah, right. Okay.
So we are just about out of time. Mamta or Jim, do either of you have any last thoughts you want to wrap up with?
No, I have only first thoughts. I never have last thoughts.
Well, I'm going to just say, please buy your books from Northshire Bookstore. They don't all have to be mine. They can be Jim's and Amy's and the two Amy's and everybody else in the audience who's a writer, but buy your books from your local independent bookstore. And thank you, Rachel and David, for hosting us.
Thank you.